Eva.
It is my honor to welcome Helen Siegel with us today to present her family story. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Helen. She is a passionate lifelong educator and learner. Her early career was spent in New York City public schools, and she recently retired as the principal of the Amos and Celia Heilicher Minneapolis Jewish Day School, where she served as a classroom teacher and administrator for 27 years. Committed to Holocaust education, Helen has spoken to students in several schools around the metro area, as well as to adults in a variety of settings about her parents' experiences as German Jews from before Kristallnacht until their emigration to the US after the war. She also speaks about the multi-generational trauma of being a child of Holocaust survivors. Her 94-year-old mother still lives in New York City and is part of a dwindling population of witnesses whose stories must be heard and shared. Helen has been greatly influenced by Elie Wiesel's words, "Do not stand idly by if you witness an injustice. You must intervene. You must interfere." That's her charge to all of us. So thank you again, Helen. As per usual, please put questions in the chat. We will get to them at the end. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'm very glad and honored to be here today. And before I start talking about my history, I wanted to honor veterans. It's Veterans Day, and I particularly thank the veterans who liberated the camps all over Europe and helped so many survivors find their way home if that was what they wanted to do. So thank you, veterans. So I'd like to start also by saying not all Holocaust survivors have the same story, nor do their children have the same stories. Each has a compelling and unique story to tell and a dramatic experience. And it's hard to measure who suffered more, those people who had to leave their countries early and find their path to a safe place, or those people who had to go through the camps and not only suffer the psychological issues that they dealt with, but also the physical horrors of being in the camps. So I'm going to start with my dad's story. My dad passed away 11 years ago, and his name was Erich Heimann, Heymann. And many of you may notice the suffix of his name as a very common suffix for a certain ethnicity. So we can talk about that later. He was German. He was born in Essen, Germany, and he lived most of his life in Cologne, Germany. He was a secular Jew, grew up in a family that didn't attend synagogues and didn't observe any of the Jewish laws, rituals. And his family was told that his family needed to get out of Germany. The neighbor that told them was a Nazi, had some role in the Nazi party, and was very adamant about getting this Jewish family out of Germany. And, you know, my grandparents kind of poo-pooed it. After all, they were German first, Jewish secondarily. And my father's grandfather had earned the Iron Cross in World War I. So, you know, they were German. And what was happening to Jews around Europe was just not going to happen to them. However, they were wrong. So this was around 1937. My father had a younger sister who married an older man who had some money, and at the age of 17, she and her new husband were able to cross the Swiss border by bribing their way across the border, and ultimately emigrated to the United States, settling in New York City. In the meanwhile, my grandparents were waiting for visas to get out of Germany, and they hadn't come to their number yet, but they were able to get my dad out of Germany because they had a relative who lived in La Paz, Bolivia, and they were able to send an affidavit to get my father over there. And so in 1941, my father left Germany and went to La Paz, Bolivia. My father was multilingual. He added Spanish to his repertoire. And while he was there, he was very active in Zionist organizations. My dad lost his parents. I mean, his parents were taken away. They never made it out of Germany. They ended up in, and probably died in Buchenwald. That said, while my father was still in Germany waiting to get out, he was very involved in the Jewish community and trying to help the families whose loved ones had been taken away to the work camps in the early part of the Holocaust. And he helped them by cataloging coffins that were coming into their city from the different work camps. And after those coffins were put in their appropriate places, it was my dad's responsibility to inform the families of those loved ones who had been deceased. And ironically, the things on their death certificates said everything from having pneumonia to having different diseases. None of them referred to any of the kind of thing that actually happened to them. My father told families about their loved ones and informed them of the deaths of those people. And then he also helped out after Kristallnacht by giving food and clothing to people in the community. And I've explained he belonged to an organization that was very similar to like United Way or the Jewish Federation at that time, helping the Jews who were still living in Cologne. We observed the memorial of Kristallnacht earlier this week, and that is the night of the broken glass, where Jewish businesses and homes were destroyed. And the people who owned those businesses were forced in the streets the next day to clean up the mess, often at gunpoint, with great humiliation. That night before Kristallnacht, my father was working for a non-Jewish man in a factory, learning how to be a bookkeeper, and was told, don't go home tonight. You should stay here. It won't be safe for you. My father rode a bicycle to and from work. And the next morning when he went home on his bicycle, he saw the destruction of his city. He saw a very large and well-known synagogue burned down. And of course, he was devastated. But when he passed this one synagogue, he was compelled to pick up a talit, a prayer shawl that had been singed and was quite dirty. But even though he wasn't a practicing Jew, he just felt compelled to take that. And later on in our lives, that prayer shawl was used under the wedding canopy, the chuppah, for two of my nephews. So it's a very special article that we will keep in our family and try to preserve for a long time. It has a tremendous amount of meaning. Okay. I'm sorry. My father suffered greatly, not physically as the survivors of the camps did. My father suffered psychologically, emotionally. We believe he had tremendous survivor's guilt because his parents didn't get out. And then after he met my mother and knew what she went through, I think it enhanced his survivor's guilt. My dad was a very proud American when he finally emigrated to the United States from Bolivia. He was fiercely proud of his ability to become an American citizen. And I have this little artifact here. This is his naturalization paper. He was so proud of this. And when he passed away, I felt this was an important thing to hold on to because there's so much history. He had some stationery at our home, a pad that has the name of the worker, and it was embossed with a Jewish Israeli flag on one side and an American flag on the other. He took enormous pride. He flew an American flag on their appropriate holidays. And every time I think about the Statue of Liberty and the poem underneath it, I get very emotional because it was so very important to my father, and his appreciation for being allowed to be an American was just enormous. And it connects me to the plight of immigrants today. He met my mom, who was a survivor of Auschwitz, on a beach in New York City on the Long Island Sound. He met her. She was in a like a rowboat and in a flowered bathing suit, and he was on a boardwalk wearing white hat and white suit, and he took out this cigarette case that was silver and it was glistening in the sun, and my mother noticed that and thought, oh, that handsome man must be very rich, I want to meet him. And that was not true. Totally not true. Anyway, they met and they lived in a part of New York City which is called Washington Heights, and it was sort of an enclave for German Jews. So there was a common language there and people felt very comfortable there. My father had a strong desire to help my mother heal from her atrocities. So they got married. My mom's story will come in a few minutes. They were married by a rabbi, and my mother was a domestic servant for very wealthy people in Manhattan, in New York. And so that very wealthy family made my parents' wedding. And I am forever grateful for that. So my mom's original name is Clarissa, but she changed it to Claire when she came to the United States. Her maiden name was Ullman, and she was born October 12th, 1924. So she's actually 90. She just turned 96. Her story is very different than my dad's. They're polar opposites in many ways and never would have met in Germany. Never. My dad was cultured, multilingual, came from the big city. My mom, a country girl, came from a small town near Frankfurt called Großheubach am Main, and it was a very small town where there was basically only one Jewish family, my mom's family. This family had been in the town for generations, and my great-great-grandfather was a cattle dealer. That's what he did for a living, a cattle dealer. And he was very well known and popular because there were Catholic monks in a monastery not too far away, and he played cards with them. So he was very well known. My mom's family was very observant, Orthodox. And in order to attend synagogue, they went to Frankfurt and stayed there for the Sabbath. My mother enjoyed holiday rituals and traditional foods, and she was one of 5 children, and they all lived a very Jewish life in this tiny German town of Großheubach. In fact, when my grandmother was baking the Friday bread called challah, she would have them baked in the baker's oven, which was like 2 houses down from where they lived. My mother attended a Catholic school. That was the public school in her hometown. It was sponsored by the government, and the nuns who taught in the Catholic school were government paid teachers. But the school closed in 1938. So my mom was in 8th grade. All the nuns were fired, and my mother and her siblings could not attend any other school. This was during the time of the Nuremberg laws. On Kristallnacht in 1938, my grandparents' home was ransacked. Their home was just destroyed. All their feather blankets, all the feathers were all over the place. Anything of any value was smashed and destroyed, and there was graffiti on their home. The Nazis had come in, and so it wasn't just in the big cities where you had storefronts being broken, but there were roving bands of Nazis that went through the different villages and did destruction as well. My grandfather was arrested and taken to Dachau that night, and after the destruction ended, the rest of the family, my grandfather, grandmother, my mother and her siblings, spent the night in jail. They weren't being punished. There was no place for them to sleep. And because of my great-grandfather's connections, the mayor of the next town allowed the family to sleep in the jail, so they had a roof over their heads, and then helped my family rebuild in the next few days. My mother never bore any animosity towards the people in her town. She felt that they did the best they could to try to help them, and nothing more than that. Where my dad really had a difficult time with Germans in general after the war, and that's a whole other story in terms of, we couldn't own German cars and German products in our home. I always struggled with the idea that as a mother, and I have two daughters, how do you just send your children away and never see them again? So my grandmother had the opportunity to send my mother and her siblings on the kinder transport to England, knowing full well that their lives would be spared, but she would likely never see them again. And she couldn't do it. So she never sent them. She just could not do it. And I think about that a lot. I think, could I do it? I don't know. They were waiting for their quota to get out of Germany, and their number never came up. They got my grandfather out of Dachau by bribing, I think it was the Dominican Republic, somebody in the Dominican Republic's embassy to get my grandfather out of Dachau. So he got out of Dachau and ultimately died in a different camp much later on. And they were waiting for their number, and the number never came. In the interim, since my mother couldn't go to school, her parents decided that she and one of her sisters needed to be doing something. And so they sent them to Frankfurt, where both my aunt and my mother became domestic workers. They were nannies, they were babysitters, they were house cleaners. 2 years into that, the Gestapo then rounded up all of these Jewish young women and took them to Berlin, where they were signed up to be munitions workers in the Siemens factory. Siemens company, I still think exists. And so they lived a pretty decent life in Berlin. They wore the yellow star, they had food rations, they had curfews, and they worked. And when my mom talked about her experience in Berlin, it was almost like she was in a college dorm, because they all tried to sneak out and get stuff on the black market, and nothing bad ever happened to them while they were in Berlin. They lived with a house mother who, quote unquote, took care of them. In 1942, my grandparents and my aunts and uncle, who did not survive, got the letter from the German government that they were to be taken away in 1942. And my mother and her sister wanted to go back home to be with them. So because they were under contract, they weren't allowed to go home. So my sister, my aunt and my mother's sister continued to work for Siemens, and her family was taken away. And what taken away meant was they were gathered in the city of Würzburg with their whatever belongings they were allowed to carry. They were put on trains, and that was the end of them. So my mother and one of her sisters never saw the rest of their family ever again. In many ways, the opportunity to work in the factory in Berlin saved my mother's life, and gave my mother a chance at life, and my aunts as well. My grandparents were 40 and 41 years old when they were taken away. One of my aunts was 14, 12, and the youngest was a boy named Theo. He was 8. They never got to say goodbye to them. When the Siemens contract ended and 120 young women were rounded up, they were put on trains to Auschwitz and Birkenau. When they arrived at Birkenau, they heard inmates whispering, "Walk, walk, keep walking." My aunt was very weak from not eating or drinking on the cattle cars, and she couldn't stand up. My mother made her walk, and as a result, she was not taken to the gas chamber. My mother and aunt were separated after a while, and my mother was sent to Auschwitz, where she had a variety of jobs which saved her life and the lives of others. Among them, she was picking weeds near the crematoria. And another job she had was hauling large boulders to pave the roads. She was working a cleaning detail in a gunpowder factory where her connections with civilians enabled her to get things like some ointments and medicines and newspapers. And she participated in the Death March in the winter of 1945 and almost never made it. Of the 120 girls who were taken to Berlin, only 8 survived. Her survival, she says, was in large part because of her knowledge of German, her timing, her strength, her resilience, and a strong will to live. Maya Angelou once said, her mission in life was not merely to survive, but to thrive. My parents made a decision to do just that. Hitler and the Final Solution didn't just directly affect the lives of my parents. It has shaped so much of who I am and what I am not. The themes of survival and perseverance have influenced many aspects of my personal and professional lives. The notion of if there's a will, there's a way was a mantra in my childhood, echoed by my parents all the time. As the firstborn to new Americans, I was acutely aware that we had very little family. My parents had no financial or emotional support from their parents or extended family. They had to go it alone, raising me and my sisters. As a young child, I was sad and jealous of other children because I had no grandparents. I didn't have grandparents with whom I could snuggle at night or on the weekend or have Shabbat dinners with or learn recipes from. I knew something very, very bad happened to them, and I know they died. My parents never, ever wanted to talk about any of that. My mom had a strange tattoo on her arm. I heard her screams in the middle of the night and no understanding of why. I learned to understand German at an early age because, like most other children, if you tell secrets in another language, they'll be forced to listen. So I was able to pick up some of the secrets, but was unable to put it all together. As I grew older, I knew something was really wrong. When my parents and friends came over and we were to go to sleep early, I overheard bits and pieces of stories about a camp, Camp Auschwitz, about a bad smell coming from the buildings, about eating frogs in ditches, eating dates and finding a gold piece inside, about a book of photographs that the soldiers gave my mom. Not exactly the image of summer camp that some of my friends attended. My parents never spoke about their experiences during World War II, and I became obsessed with finding out about them. My youngest sister was a baby when I was 12, and I always encouraged my parents to go out so I could babysit. And when they finally allowed me to do this, and after the baby was asleep, I often searched the house to get more information. And one day I found a booklet of photographs taken by American soldiers and what looked like mounds of prehistoric fossils. When I realized those fossils were human limbs, I finally realized what happened to my family. Maybe my grandparents were in those piles, or my aunts, or my uncle. I became physically ill and became obsessed with all things having to do with the Holocaust. Perhaps the most profound influence on my outlook on life, in spite of the horror and the fear evoked by my discoveries, was one of the last things written in the diary of Anne Frank. In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. And those who know me would agree that I give people the benefit of the doubt to a fault, especially people who I worked with. My colleagues are like, why do you give everybody the benefit of the doubt? So how did it affect my life, my day-to-day life, growing up, I often heard this could happen again from my father, referring to anti-Semitism, and he wasn't wrong. I heard my mom say when we were misbehaving and she was getting really angry, Hitler didn't kill me and you children will kill me. And it was like, how could she say something like that? And when we had problems growing up, especially as teenagers, my mother would say, you don't have any problems. Is there a gun pointing at your head? Or tonight we're having Nazi vegetables for dinner. And I'm like, I was just like so freaked out by all of that. Nazi vegetables, by the way, in her description were turnips. And, you know, we had to finish everything on our plate. Well, I didn't want any part of those Nazi vegetables. In our family, laziness was the biggest crime you could commit. Sleeping in was unheard of because we were expected to be as productive as possible and more. After all, you know, in the camps, if you weren't productive, you went to the gas chambers. Our elementary school attendance was excellent and we never got sick until school breaks. It's so crazy. My sister and I, my next sister and I, used to receive these certificates at the end of the school year in elementary school for 100% attendance. And there was just no getting sick during the school year. And by some miracle, we got chicken pox, German measles, mumps, all those diseases that are not part of today's lives during our school breaks. I have a fear of fire, surprises. I do not like surprises. I don't ever want a surprise party. Loud noises startle me. When my husband and I'll just share this quick story. I lived in New York and I was in a store once and the store was being robbed while I was in the store. And the dressing room in which I was changing was up a flight of steps. And all of a sudden I hear footsteps in the hallway and I felt scared and I heard voices going, come into the other room, get down on the floor, and we're robbing this place. And I was freaking out because I wasn't thinking about a robbery. I'm thinking the Nazis are coming to take me away. And I was an adult. Anyway, we were all robbed. We had to lay on the floor and have our hands tied behind us. And they said, don't look. And all they wanted was the cash register. And I had the pants on, which I was trying on, and the zipper was open. So I looked like I might be pregnant. And so I told the gunman, I'm pregnant. I'm not lying on the floor. And I stood up. And I remember looking at them through a fire extinguisher. Don't look at us and don't report us to the police. And anyway, no one got hurt. I was the only one who had seen them. And I did go down to the precinct because I wanted them arrested. I don't know if they were ever found, but that experience was just completely laced with Germans and Nazis and all of that. When my husband and I moved to Chicago and we had their first grandchild, the separation created nightmares for me because I kept thinking about my mother's family and my father's family, you know, separating from their children and how hard that was. It wasn't until then that I realized that there was such a strong connection to the Holocaust. There's been so much recent research about multi-generational PTSD and how it has affected descendants of Holocaust survivors and other groups that experienced genocide. The findings of the research have few surprises, as my sisters and I could easily have been part of those studies, as could my daughters, because I see certain things that have trickled down to a third generation. There is evidence that the long-term effect of dehumanization can actually change DNA. And the notion of dehumanization is one that is so broad because that is what happened to survivors of genocide, long-term dehumanization. In spite of all this, I've thrived and I've been blessed with a wonderful life and family of my own, the ultimate revenge on Hitler. I'm passionate about Holocaust education because unfortunately fewer and fewer people know about it. Recently, there have been statistics about millennials, not to say anything bad about millennials, not knowing basic facts about the Holocaust. And I think it is incumbent upon as many who are comfortable to speak about the Holocaust and to tell the experiences of their parents, because we are the witnesses that are left. And when I spoke to a high school in St. Paul once, a young man raised his hand without being disrespectful after I'd spoken and said, "How do you know this really happened? How do you know it really happened?" And in this day and age of Holocaust deniers, first I was upset and I thought his teachers were going to go crazy, but it was a legitimate question. And I just said, "I know it really happened because my mother has a tattoo on her arm. My mother screams in the middle of the night. I don't have grandparents. And we have information that can prove that it really happened." Fast forward to this year. In January of 2020, to observe the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, I had the opportunity to go to Auschwitz with my then 95-year-old mother. And there were really no words to describe the experience to be there with my mother. And one of my daughters, my husband, one of my sisters, and her husband. I'd like to share with you just a little background about the trip. I think I'm going to read my mother's reflections first. On Saturday night, January 25th, I went to Poland. This time I chose to go. And again, these are my mother's words. I was very lucky that my family could come with me. I participated in a survivors delegation, which included families and dignitaries from many different places around the world, including Israel, Canada, parts of Europe, and the US. I was very unsure about going on this trip, and it wasn't because I'm 95. Although my doctors cleared me to go physically, I wasn't sure I could handle being back to that place where I suffered and lost so much. I decided that I needed to get it out of my system. I traveled with two of my daughters, one granddaughter, two sons-in-law. I was ready to face the past, not knowing how I would react. When we arrived in Poland, we were greeted at the Krakow airport by youth members of the Krakow JCC, with hugs and dancing and music and the singing of Am Yisrael Chai, the nation of Israel lives. I broke down and I cried. I was so overwhelmed. One of the highlights of the trip was attending the ceremony on January 27th at the gates of death at Birkenau, where the train stopped and the Jewish men, women, and children got out to be sent to the gas chambers or to do work. There were thousands of people in attendance at the ceremony. Representatives from foreign countries, survivors, their companions, the international press. I even got to say hello to Governor Cuomo of New York, who was a guest there with his family at the ceremony. The ceremony was televised in many countries and included some very emotional speeches. Listening to Ronald Lauder, president of the World Jewish Congress and the board chair of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Foundation, moved me so much. I will not forget his passion and his dedication to preserving the memory of those who died and the camps where they perished. He spoke from his heart, so no one could forget. Next day we visited the camps, and it rained earlier in the day and the sky was dark and the air cold and damp. First we went to the Auschwitz Museum. So many memories came back. I remembered at one roll call, 4 women were hung in front of us. These 4 women worked with me in a munitions factory near the camp. They stole gunpowder to help blow up the crematorium. They were caught, beaten, and hung. They were my friends. I had to cut down one of the dead bodies. I am still haunted by this memory every day. Our first stop at Birkenau was by one of the crematoria. We lit candles, and a man in our group sang a memorial prayer called the El Male Rachamim. We all said Kaddish, and this gave me some comfort. Kaddish is the prayer that Jewish people sing when someone in their family dies. My children cried. They cried with me. I really wanted to see the barracks in which I lived, and with my walker and sometimes wheelchair, I went as fast as I could to get there, even though our guide wanted to talk about other things along the way. I told him I didn't need his help and that I could give the tour. When we arrived at Block 9, I was very disappointed because I couldn't go inside. I stood in Block 9 feeling very upset. The crematorium was only 3 blocks away from there. I remembered the smoke coming from the chimney, day and night, night and day. The first job I had in Birkenau was pulling weeds from the electrified barbed wire near the crematorium. I remembered being able to talk to the workers there and even get some extra food, which was thrown over the fence. Once I caught a date and found a gold piece inside, which I could organize to get more food. A prisoner who was good at trading and deal making was called an organizer, and I was an organizer. Being at Auschwitz-Birkenau was very, very hard for me. I remembered so many things I never told my family before, like the young women who gave up hope and threw themselves against the electrified barbed wire that we were pulling weeds from to end their suffering. This was a very hard trip, and I can't believe that I returned to that horrible place. I am not sure how I will be when I get home, but I do not regret going back. I hope that I can be at peace now, that I was able to feel this and do this, and I can enjoy the few years that I have left with my family. This is me talking. We are charged never to forget. I can't forget from hearing my mother's screams in the middle of the night when I was a child. And more recently, when we returned from Poland, from the tattoo on her arm, from the enormity of Auschwitz and Birkenau, from the emaciated piles of dead bodies that I saw in photos, which could have been the family that I never had, the vastness of the camps, the magnitude of the horror, the depths of depravity continue to be devastating to me. How could this happen? A question I will continue to ask myself in perpetuity. And I'd like to share a few photographs and then a slideshow from the trip. The first photograph I wanted to show is before we went on the trip. This is, I don't know if everyone can see this. This is the women in our immediate family, and under the chuppah, under the wedding canopy, is my father's talit. This was after a wedding, and it was just a joyous time to be together. This is another picture, and it's kind of an ironic picture. And there was a dinner on the trip, and there's a picture of my mom holding a medal. I don't know how you give a medal to a survivor. Surviving is not it is an act of courage and bravery, obviously, because when you survive, it shows how strong you are, your strength. But it just seems so odd to get as a gift at a dinner a medal for being a survivor. And I'll just share this one really quickly. This is my family at the opening dinner of the trip to Poland. So here we go. On our way, boarding the flight in Newark, New Jersey, with this group of people, the delegation from the organization that was being sponsored, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Foundation. And you can see there are a lot of wheelchairs getting people on the flight. This was a chartered flight that my mother and I went on together because I was my mom's companion. My mom looks very anxious in this picture, and I was too. She's getting a little more comfortable. It was a gorgeous plane flight, just very comfortable accommodations. When we arrived at the airport in Krakow, we were greeted with these signs. And I'm not sure I have a picture of it here, but there was singing and dancing and accordion music and tambourines. And it was overwhelming just to see a Jewish community center in Krakow, Poland, with a Hillel. Just, it's just justice, after all their experiences. This was the, I guess, opening event of the delegation, and you can see how many people were there. Lots and lots and lots of people, and there were lots of speeches, including a speech by Ronald Lauder. And you can see name of the foundation. J-Roots, by the way, is the organization that organized all of the travel, hotel accommodations, etc. This was the premiere of Poland. This was a group of people that came from Israel and all over the world. And the woman, there's a tiny woman with red hair and a floral scarf. She's the matriarch of that family. And they went up on the stage singing, Am Yisrael Chai, Israel Lives, and we're very upbeat. We gathered at a plaza outside of a lunch stop on our way to the ceremony that was televised around the world. And people were just waiting for a group shot here, a group photo shot. More survivors sitting to be photographed. This is the arrival at Birkenau. And what you see in the background is, they're called the gates of death. When people arrived on the railroads, they went through there. And my mom was walking towards her seat. Before we show the next slide, so this was another PTSD down to generation story. We were sitting on the tour bus, my mother and I, and we were told that when we arrive at Birkenau, we're going to get off the bus, and we had to have our security check. There was a lot of security. But when we get off the bus, the survivors were going to go into an entrance to the tent one way, and the companions were going to go in another way into the tent where the ceremony was, so that we were going to be separated and seated in different places. And I believe the reason for that was they wanted the impact of the numbers of people, of the survivors, grouped together to just make an impact about this is how many are left. We get off the bus and the tour guide is saying, okay, survivors go to the left, family go to the right. And I froze because it just reminded me of what happened when people arrived at the camps. Some people go one way, some people go the other way. And then my mom screams, "Why aren't you coming with me, Helen?" And I froze again, and I kept thinking, that's what happened at the camps. And then she went in. And then I said to myself, why did I obey the rules? Why didn't I go with my mom? And if we were at the camps, I don't know what would have happened. Maybe we would have both been killed. But at that moment, it was such an eerie and frightening and uncanny feeling. And I walked in the correct entrance. Obviously, I trusted the tour guides. I knew we weren't going to be taken away. But I got to my seat and I just broke down. Anyway, I did get to go up front and see that she was settled properly, but I just thought I would tell that story. Next slide. The railroad tracks there are actually covered with lucite, and there are lights underneath it, but the trains would have gone into that area when they arrived at the camps. And this is when the ceremony, before the ceremony started, under a big tent. This is what I mentioned about the trains. They have the tracks, and it's sort of like a museum piece in the middle of the plaza there. Train tracks. This was our entrance to the Auschwitz Museum, which was very different than I expected. And in my entire life and teaching about the Holocaust and learning about it, I never thought I'd be standing under that sign. It was such a grim and nasty day, but my mother was so motivated. She was ready to go on her walker. This is a wall that was very near where my mom worked that has flowers memorializing people who were shot in this particular alleyway from the different countries for breaking rules, for stealing, for doing something that obviously got them killed. Yeah, I can't imagine what was going through my mom's mind in that picture. This was the entrance to that alleyway where you had those flowers, where those people were shot. Now we're near the crematorium. They were destroyed by the Germans. They didn't want any evidence of them, but this is what remains. And again, the enormity of the camp was just mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. We had the opportunity to light candles for our loved ones and for all who perished. And I just couldn't stop crying. There's mom. She's on the hunt. She was looking for the barracks that she lived in for 2 years and was determined to find it. Unfortunately, we found it, but it was cordoned off because they were restoring it for the museum part, and she couldn't get in, and she was devastated that she couldn't get in and see it. The tent in the background is where the big ceremony was held. My mom ran about 10 feet in front of the tour guide. And this was also near the crematoria, and it's very poignant. To the memory of the men, women, and children who fell victim to the Nazi genocide, here lie their ashes. May their souls rest in peace. Yeah. There's just one other thing I wanted to share about the experience at the camp. when my mother told the story of the women who stole the gunpowder at the munitions factory, she and maybe 3 other survivors collected an enormous amount of money to build a sculpture in honor of these women at Yad Vashem in the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Israel. And in 1993, for our eldest daughter's bat mitzvah, we went to Israel, and we were standing next to this beautiful sculpture. And I wish I had a photograph of it with me, but I don't. And there was me and my children and my parents and my husband. Just being there, just being was justice, because I felt like saying, you could not kill us. Here we are. And to memorialize those brave women who stole the gunpowder was just powerful beyond words. So that was the trip to Poland that we took this past January. I'm just wondering if people have any questions.
Thank you, Helen, for sharing this. This is not an easy story to listen to, but obviously a very important one. I have a question. You said your parents did not talk about this growing up, when you were growing up. Does your mother talk about it now, or going back, did that?
I put a lot of those pieces together myself. The Spielberg interviews was like pulling the cork on my parents. After they participated in those testimonials, they started to begin to talk about it outside of their immediate friends that had survived. And that was very helpful. I was about 30 years old when they really started to talk about it. So, and I was always afraid to ask questions because I didn't want them to have to remember painful things. But from that point on, my mom started to speak on a regular basis. And just last year, she came to visit, and we were going to start, we started this tradition of visiting a resort up north. And we had a couple of days before, and I have a friend who teaches in a Bloomington junior high school. And so she always organizes Yom HaShoah, and we spoke, and I took my mom with me, and we kind of bookended it. My mom spoke, and she was very nervous about not remembering, sequences, because she was so much older. So we bookended it, survivor, child of a survivor, and if she forgot something, I filled in for her. So she did a lot of public speaking in a lot of schools. And yeah, she doesn't want to do it anymore. I don't think she could anymore because her memory is starting to go, but it was a very important thing. And she just participated in something called the Witness Project in New York. And they created an amazing film of the program and what she did. And she didn't want to do that. We said, you have to, because when that generation is gone, who is going to tell what happened? That's the legacy that I'm taking on. And, Elie Wiesel said, if you're a witness to a witness, you're a witness.
Mm-hmm.
So
we're grateful for you relaying these stories. Thank you. There's still time if anybody has any questions, but I do want to bring the awareness that there is a program on December 3rd and 4th. We're going to send out more information about it. In regards to Helen talking about intergenerational trauma, there is, it's called Through the Lens of the Holocaust, Trauma and Intergeneration Trauma. Explore the long-reaching reverberations of mass trauma influencing the individual survivor, spouses, and children born years after the trauma ends. So there will be more information coming. And there is a question. What is your opinion of the Survivor Hologram project taking place in museums around the world, if you're familiar with that, Helen?
I haven't actually seen it in person, and I've seen it on TV. I don't know how I feel about it. I don't. It could be a wonderful thing, or it could be feeding into the made up. Is this the truth? Is this real? Is this, the voice of a robot? I don't know. It's very new, and my sensitivities are what they are, but it could also be incredibly important, and then paired with a live follow-up with a relative would make it even more powerful, I think. No other questions? Oh, I just wanted to add one other thing. So one of our children is looking to move for more space. Too many months, pandemic, working from home. And I was sent the Zillow listing with the picture of the house and the inside. So in the inside of the house, so this is how it's so stuck in my brain, there's a fireplace. I look at the fireplace in the house, and it has two separate doors, brass doors that are rounded side by side. And I look at this, and the first thing I think of is the ovens. And there are things like that all the time. When I was an adult, not living with my parents, driving over to their home one evening, headlights facing a steel garbage can in front of my parents' house. My parents lived on Jewel Avenue, and they had painted their address on the garbage can. That's what people did back then. And I'm driving there, and all I see is JEW. And it's just in my head, in my being, in my soul. Just things like that every day. It's just part of everything.
Helen, we have time for one last question, I think. Somebody asked about the Children of Survivor community. Do you speak with each other and share stories, experiences?
Yes, there's an organization called Chaim, Children of Holocaust Survivors Association in Minnesota. We used to meet pre-pandemic. We are going to virtually meet. We have opportunities to talk to each other, to share stories. One of our group members is Eva Maremi, who is in class today, and she wrote an amazing cookbook about her mother's experience, which she presented to the group before she actually wrote the book. So people share different things. We get to know each other. We're as different as the experiences were for our families, we're also different in how we internalized their experiences, and where you are in your birth placement has an enormous impact. Those of us who were born closer to the war have a different experience than those who were born many years later. But we do have an organization, and now there's another one called Generations After, which is a group of people involved in Holocaust education who are third generation. And it's not a therapy group. It's not intended to be a therapy group, but it's educational. Sometimes there are book groups that come out of it, and just the friendship and kinship with people who had a similar experience. And it's wonderful. I'm very pleased to be part of that.
Thank you again. Thank you for all being here, and thank you, Helen, for sharing this. As you know from what we've said in the past, this is recorded and will be available to view again later. So thank you all. Today is Wednesday, so there's 2 more days left of the fall session of this. So thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye. Okay. Are we going to debrief now or?
I think there's still some people on, so
Okay.
I'll be in touch.
Okay,
Thanks,
great.
Helen. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.